There's a lot happening with New Jersey's child welfare system. We want to help you make sense of it and share our story. This is DCF on the Air.
This is DCF on the Air, and I'm Jason Bukowski. In August of 1974, Governor Brendan Burns signed legislation establishing the Division on Women within state government. And for the last 50 years, this organization has served as a vital voice for women's rights and interests across state government. This year, we're actually celebrating the 50th anniversary of the establishment of the Division on Women. And I'm joined today by two of the leaders within the current Division on Women. And I'm going to turn it over to them to introduce themselves shortly. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the work of the Division on Women as it stands today. It's such a diverse portfolio, and I think it fits so well with the work that's happening throughout the Department of Children and Families to support families across the board. When you think of the Division on Women, it's helping survivors of domestic violence and sexual violence heal from their trauma. It's empowering women leaders of tomorrow. It's supporting families with displaced homemaker assistance, and so much more. So really excited to have these two women with us today to talk a little bit about their work and what the future holds for DOW. So,
Great.
Anna?
Thank you, Jason. Hello, everyone. I'm Anna Martinez. I am the Director for the Division on Women. And
Yes, good morning, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity. I am Frances Blanco, and I serve as Deputy Director for the Division on Women.
Great. Welcome to DCF on the Air.
Thank you.
thank you.
How do you see the mission of DOW changing since it was first launched in 1974? I think the landscape nationally has changed in the last 50 years, but how has DOW sort of changed with the times?
So thank you, Jason. So as you mentioned in your opening, the Division on Women was created by the state legislature and signed by Governor Byrne in 1974. And it really was a unique feat at the time, a pioneering state agency that really was dedicated to looking at how different policies and programmatic priorities have impacted women. And so I would say from that time, we'd have to really consider the context over those 50 years and how much has changed for women. So obviously, in 1974, just taking as an example, one of the biggest issues that we work on at the division is domestic violence and sexual violence. And if you look at 1974, you didn't have the big pieces of legislation that really shifted how we as a nation look at those issues, right? So in 1974, you had domestic violence treated as a private family matter. There really wasn't a light shown on it, and there was a lot of shame and stigma attached to it. And with that, all the different systems also weren't treating domestic violence as the crime that it was and is.
Yeah.
And 20 years later, so fast forward 20 years to 1994 is when we see the passage of the Violence Against Women Act. Wow, and that created really just such a sea change in how different systems treat domestic violence. So everyone from law enforcement to the courts to medical professionals to the advocates themselves. And that really shifted the way we do this work. So I would say we have changed with those times. So I'd say New Jersey was ahead of the curve. In 1974, domestic violence wasn't even a crime in every one of the 50 states. So from that, our inception to today, there has been such a shift culturally in our issues. Obviously, with employment, that has completely shifted for women as well, right?
Yeah.
How women participated in the workforce in 1974 versus today, for example. And we have shifted with those times as well. I would say something that's really changed also in the way we look at women's issues is we look at the many different facets. So the concept of intersectionality and the fact that it's not just you're a woman, but you're a woman of color, your sexual orientation, your gender identity, your religion, your socioeconomic status, your educational attainment, all of those different social facets impact the individual. And so the work, right, nationally and here in New Jersey has really shifted to take all of that into account, to really meet the survivors and individual women where they are in order to give them the best access for services.
Sure. And I think when we think back to the circumstances 50 years ago, what women were dealing with then, I think the sea change in how we treat survivors of domestic violence, I think is obviously a big thing. But I think there are still pockets of stigma. And one of the areas I think is a misconception about the work of the Division on Women is that it supports all survivors of domestic violence and sexual violence. So we could be talking about, LGBT couples. We could be talking about men. So it really covers the gamut. But I think that there are still those pockets of stigma, and it's okay to talk about it in some circles, but not other circles. How are we addressing stigma specifically? How are we opening up the dialogue and the conversation around domestic violence and bringing this to the light of public scrutiny?
Well, that's a great question. And I absolutely agree with you that there is still stigma attached to domestic violence and to sexual violence. And I would say that it also really depends on the cultural context as well. Mm-hmm. In certain communities, there's, not even a real word for domestic violence. And so those are a bit harder for us to get at, right? And that's why we try to work with partners in those communities who are trusted leaders in those communities who can really address that issue by working within the community, right? So it's important to get champions, local champions, right, who will say this isn't okay, right? So if that's a religious leader who can say, no, our faith does not say that this is okay. It says this is, against our faith, right? So we work in those communities to really get at those champions. Other ways to really address that stigma is by shining a light on the issue and talking about the issue. We have certain times of the year that are dedicated, right? We have our awareness months, in October for domestic violence and April for sexual violence, where we really try to do some myth busting, right, around these issues, mm-hmm. and really try to get into the community and have others talk about it and say that, this is not a woman's issue because it isn't a woman's issue, right? And men are also victims, but beyond that, it takes everyone to collectively address it, right? And I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about our boys' work, but we do very specific work with engaging boys and men to end violence against women and girls.
Sure. Yeah. And I think about something like the VOSI program, where it really is treated through our system like a family issue. And the solution is a family solution. It's all of us coming together, but it's understanding you mentioned intersectionality, but also intersectionality between domestic violence and child maltreatment and violence in the home. And so all of these things kind of play in to destabilize the family, but thankfully the family is able to address all these things as a healing unit, as a nurturing unit, with the proper supports and the assistance from the division and from the department. So I think that's a fantastic thing. Francis, the saying is the more things change, the more things stay the same. So we talked a little bit about how things have changed over 50 years and how our work has changed to sort of accommodate that and put that within the context of the times. But I'm wondering, what are the things that we do right now through DOW that sort of relate to that foundational mission of the division? And Anna, you can chime in on this too, but what are those things that are happening right now that have like a through line? This is something that DOW has always been about over the course of 50 years.
As you said, Jason, the more they change, the more they stay the same. And I think, to the core, even in our incorporation, it says, it's a continuous study of the issues of women in New Jersey. So as the issues move and evolve and change, so does our work. So in many ways, they stay the same because employment readiness, violence against women and girls, access to education.
Yeah.
These were the issues, and how we were represented 50 years ago remain the same. But again, as Anna referenced earlier, how we go about them and how we treat them, where are we today? Is it the immediate issue or now more of a long term? What opportunities have been created? Who are other partners that are at the table? And how do we work with them? Again, I think at times we were, you have to meet the immediate. Keep them safe, keep them healthy, and keep them connected.
Yep.
Okay. But at the same time now it's what is the cause? And therefore, it's part of the solution. Okay. We know part of the cause is the men and boys. Bring them in to be our allies and being part of the solution. So I think, again, if we had to narrow it down, I would say it's anti-violence work. It is this empowerment and advancement, being able to give women the voice, not the opportunities, create the opportunities for women to lift their voice and also mentor them on how to lift those voices on the issues as they see them themselves. Here again, it takes into account the race, the ethnicity, your culture. What we may have the same issue, but how you address it or Anna address it may be totally different from where I'm coming from. So those lived experiences must be part of it. So I would say that we continue our work, our foundational work of meeting those needs, of keeping up to breast of not only the needs, but how each community addresses it. It's intentional, particular to them. Okay, ensuring not only the immediate, but also the sustainability of that movement, women, and also incorporating those different voices, including the younger voices.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And I do want to talk about that because, some of the exciting things that are happening at DOW right now are around how do we lift up the leaders of tomorrow. But one of the things you talked about was how do we find our partners, and bringing in other people. It's not just the work of DOW. It's not just the work of DCF. Recently, I know that the Commission on the Status of Women engaged in work to develop a report about the priorities of women throughout the state of New Jersey. Can you talk a little bit about that effort?
Sure. It's an amazing, again, it's, working with the New Jersey Advisory Commission on the Status of Women, an amazing group of women appointed by the governor, with advice and consent, of course, from the Senate, but partnering with them and really, if they're set out to really lead and be the voice of women across the state, the key question was, well, let's hear from the women. And again, setting out with them, putting out a survey that very few, we had over 3,000 responses just to the initial survey. And this was from women from all aspects of life in New Jersey, socio-demographic, and the answer was very clear. Nothing new, access to childcare, access to health care, gender parity, equal pay, career development, and violence. Violence, not just that, that one-on-one, but even our community level violence, and how do we change that? So the commission, the advisory commission worked. Who do we go to? Again, because it's a partnership and it's a coordinated response. We went to our partners at the Department of Labor, State Employment and Training Commission, and the Gender Parity Council. That's what they're there for. And then we said, okay, we're very good at this, but we're not the experts on research. Well, let's go to Rutgers at the Center for Women in Work, who has a tremendous body of research that's already done. And again, it's about connecting and leveraging, the researches of others. And all three came together, produced this report that I have to tell you, and we over 15 different locations across the state, and things that even we at our level were surprises, and communities that you think, they're well off, but hey, do we know that in Cape May, the services for women that are pregnant are limited? Yeah. You don't think of those things. Do you think of in, Northwest Jersey, affluent, for the most part, affluent communities, can't even get, even when they have the money, can't get transportation. Yeah. So again, but these are the things that we need to know are current. It's not live, but it's so current. It's a couple of months, and we can address immediately. And that's the partnerships. Those are the results of our partnerships.
Yeah.
Amongst the many others, that we work with, with our culturally specific, partners, on GB housing, and other areas.
Yeah. When I think about the style of leadership between, the differences between people that look like me and people that look like you, not necessarily me, not necessarily you, just, and I'm drawing generalities, but I do think that men tend to lead they tend to go solo. It's like, I have this idea, I'm going to see it through. I'm going to, pull myself up by my bootstraps and do it on my own. And they don't even recognize that, no, you never do it on your own. There's always a group behind you. I think women leaders it's more of the village. It's more of the lead with partnerships, lead with empathy, lead with, with a sense of shared vision and direction. And I bring that up to say, I know that one of the priorities of DOW is talking to young girls, talking to younger women about how do we develop them as the leaders of tomorrow. And I think that historically, the challenges have been that they don't see themselves in leadership roles. They don't see themselves reflected in leadership roles. And it's making sure that they have representation at the top. They have a voice, and they're confident in their voice. How is DOW, what is DOW doing in the space around girls and young women leadership? And what's next for that?
I'll start.
Yeah, please.
I appreciate that comment. And I think that what's really been interesting to see with our girls' work, and we held a summit and heard from the girls directly, and many of them said they didn't even know kind of what you said. They didn't really know they had that in them to be leaders. They hadn't seen themselves as leaders. But then when they're amongst their peers from around the state, and we truly were from all around the state, bussed in to this summit in New Brunswick, and it was really something truly special to watch, because you could see that they were learning from each other and gaining confidence themselves as they did. Because I think that for girls, they need to have the opportunity to actually show that they can lead. Mm-hmm. And I think that sometimes those opportunities aren't really present for them. Yeah. So what we really focus on is making sure that this is still girl-led. What we don't want for this to be is the adults saying, okay, this is how you do these things. We have the adults there as mentors and guides for the girls, but it's really up to the girls to create the projects. Many of them created their own projects in their communities that went across the board, from wellness but I think what's really important is for us as an agency to be working with our partners, our community partners, to be even providing these opportunities for girls to take these leadership roles and then gain that confidence.
No, agree entirely. And just as a backdrop, I think, and a key point you made is, really listening to the girls. For example, much of the work that has been done is when we set out, okay, leadership development for girls. The girls themselves told us, leadership, great models, training models, STEM, this, that. They're like, we're not there.
Yeah.
For them, leadership was, turned out to be advocacy. So really a lot of the work, as Anna mentioned, has been, okay, to share, as adults, to share with the girls the power of their voices and how to use those voices in a way where they advocate for themselves and before adults on behalf of their peers. And then the other side, as Anna said, is creating those opportunities for them to actually utilize those voices. And, in the summit, we have what we call our youth advisory board. 10 girls from across the state, all from different backgrounds. And they presented last year's United Nations Conference of Women on what it is for adults to work with youth. Like, how powerful is that, for these women? And they will be working. They are core now, part of the state's efforts to celebrate the 250-year anniversary. Our girls are joining girls from Alice Paul Institute to create, a summit, a voice where their narrative is told in relationship to that progress 250 years ago, what stories were not told. So again, that civic engagement, community aspect of it and telling their narrative, they'll be core, they'll be leaders, representing New Jersey in that. And, one of the questions you ask is, what's next? I know one of the things that we've all discussed is like, the sky's the limit. Yeah, it sounds corny, but the sky is the limit, and we would love to see, for example, modeling the White House, a New Jersey council on women and girls, really with all the state agencies. But bottom line, it's to continue to provide that mentorship and use our leveraging power to open up those venues and create those opportunities for the girls. They know what they need. They know how they need it. We just got to give them the chance to and guide them on, how to leverage it.
Yeah, that's fantastic to hear. Going back to survivor supports for a second. When we spoke earlier, you'd said something about, the cultural context in which domestic violence occurs. And we have in New Jersey sort of a unique approach to how do we address that cultural context? How are we speaking to survivors, not only in their own language, but, in the context of their culture and heritage and religion? Can we talk a little bit about the culturally sensitive providers and the network of culturally sensitive providers that are working with DOW to expand our work?
Sure. So the culturally specific providers are they're from the community. So the actual people who run the organization, the advocates that are working directly with the survivors are of that culture, right? And I remember an example from one of our providers who works with Muslim women, and she said, I don't have to explain my hijab. I can just go in there and they're wearing hijab. They understand. I don't have to explain myself.
Sure.
And I love that example because it really illustrates the importance of these providers, because when you're going through intense trauma and trying to, whether you're living in that violent relationship, trying to get out, or just recently left, wherever you are in your journey, you've experienced trauma, and what you don't need is another level of another traumatic experience of being told you're, or you're not understood, or you're different, or whatever that might be. And so we look at the culturally specific organizations as they have cultural assets. Like the fact that they're of that culture, that's an asset, right? Mm-hmm. It's not a barrier, right? Whereas sometimes going to a traditional provider, and it's not always the case, many traditional providers are set up to work in the community because our communities in New Jersey all around are so diverse. Yeah. So if you're a county-based provider, we are hoping that you are equipped to work with all parts of that county, the communities within that county, right? But the culturally specific providers are just especially equipped to really meet those survivors where they are, understand their culture. If they speak a different language, to speak to them in that language, which is very different than using a translation service, right? When you can actually have a face-to-face conversation and not a third person, it makes a really big difference in terms of the connection, because that's really so important when you are providing a service, is establishing that trust with the survivor. And so being able to actually communicate in their language makes a huge difference.
Yeah, and I think it supports empathy kind of going in both ways, right? Because if you have that trust that this woman knows what I've gone through because they look like me, they practice the same religion, they're in the same community, they know the streets that I grew up on, having that level of empathy and support from someone who looks like you, I think has so much potential to heal.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I think that thinking about the work of the culturally sensitive, culturally specific providers, and this idea of empathy, and that it goes both ways, that, when survivors are met with somebody that speaks their language, that practices their religion, that grew up on the same streets that they grew up on, that, they know the community in and out. It's so important to, establishing that rapport that supports healing. And I think that's what's amazing about the culturally specific provider network, that we're doing this in a way that is responsive to New Jersey's diversity, and addresses the needs of survivors, across the expanse of that diversity, that we're talking to all women, all survivors, and getting them the help that they need, the healing and assistance that they need to be able to recover from an incident of domestic violence or sexual violence, because I think they work in both spaces, right?
That's correct, yes.
Yeah. Thinking more about the supports that are available for survivors of specifically domestic violence. I know that one of the areas within the current budget that was really exciting to me when I heard about it was the work that we're doing to sort of transform how we approach housing supports. We historically, we had provided support through shelter space. During the COVID pandemic, that became impossible to do safely. We started using something called the Hotel Aggregator Program and federal support for that. But now we're talking a little bit differently. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the supportive housing model that we're looking to roll out through DOW.
Sure, absolutely. So it's called Domestic Violence Housing First, and it is an evidence-based model used in several other jurisdictions. In New Jersey, we went full steam ahead and we are implementing it in all 21 counties with 31 providers. And really the idea is that in order to achieve safety for a survivor and their children, that they have to have housing first, right? You need a safe place to be, right? Without that, imagine all of the anxiety, it's hard to do the other things that you need to do. So the domestic violence providers, including the culturally specific providers who are also part of it, provide that housing support first. We have 31 housing navigators that we fund across the state who are that key advocate in helping the survivor. So they're working in the community, they're getting the lay of the land in terms of, because we all know that housing is very difficult.
Sure, yeah.
Affordable housing in New Jersey is very difficult to get. And so they're working, right, with landlords and other community providers to access different housing options for those survivors. And this is a very different model than we've used in the past in New Jersey. So we have always been focused on emergency shelter. And as you said, during the pandemic, because the DV shelters all had to observe the CDC guidelines around social distancing, so therefore they had to reduce their capacity, and that's when we went to the hotels. And that was a critical lifeline at the time, right? Because as the shelter space was reduced, the demand for services increased. So you had those like opposing forces. Yeah. And so having access to those hotel rooms was really important. But then in the field, and that's what's really important about our work, we don't do it in a silo. We don't DCF or DOW make these decisions. We talk to our partners. We talk to our sister government agencies, right, around what's happening. And we especially did that during COVID, which was amazing. I felt like we obviously went through a lot, but we gained a lot in terms of our partnerships and building that trust.
Yeah.
And so with the partners, we all concluded that we needed something different. Hotels is not the answer, and even shelter is not the answer, right? And we needed to really look for different solutions. And we did a really expansive study, or literature review around the different models available, and we landed on domestic violence housing first as really an amazing opportunity for us to shift how we do domestic violence housing work in New Jersey.
Yeah. And I think of it almost like representing the hierarchy of needs, like safe shelter first, and then we can address all the other things. But the idea of it being sort of a supportive evidence-based model is that not only are we getting you connected to that housing support, but now we're also going to be able to connect you to the other assistance and supports once you've been safely housed to ensure that you can, go along your recovery journey. The other thing that I really love about this program is that I think that, we were focused sort of on the emergency. We were focused on, we need to get this person out safely now and use shelter space, use the hotels. And while that I think addresses the immediate need, it also tends to other people. You're not in that sort of regular living situation. You're not in that regular living situation. And I think that can sort of ostracize survivors. And I think by moving to like a housing first model, we're normalizing it. We're saying, you can live in the community and go through your recovery, and we're not putting people like separating them from what their normal experiences are. I tend to think of, the idea of, and I think this is true, survivors of domestic violence sometimes stay in those relationships because they can't take their pet into the shelter.
Right.
They can't take their dog or cat into the hotel with them. So by doing this, we're making it easier for people to access support and achieve recovery. And I think that's so wonderful.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I will say one thing about the hotels is that survivors, the pets is a really big issue, actually. Mm-hmm. They don't want to leave behind their pets.
Yeah.
They don't want their pets to be abused either, right? And actually hotels were a good solution for some of them because of the pet-friendly hotels.
Yeah.
So, but I agree completely that with DV Housing First, what you're getting is a home, right? And starting to have a longer horizon to see like a more stable future for
Mm-hmm.
yourself, right? Yep. Because you're getting a home in the community where you want to be.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned sister state agencies, and in 2012, DOW actually came to DCF. At the time, prior to that, it was a division within the Department of Community Affairs, and then it came over to DCF. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about what that move to DCF, what that was like, and what were some of the benefits to moving the portfolio of services that DOW oversaw to DCF. Where can we find those partnerships and synergies being a part of this department versus a part of DCA? As much as, I think there's probably benefits and, downsides to any department where DOW might reside. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about why the partnership with DCF works so well.
Sure. And just in full disclosure, I wasn't here during that time when that move actually happened, but I have heard a lot from others about it. Mm-hmm. And I can definitely speak to why I think DOW is a really good fit within DCF. From safe, healthy, and connected, that is our mission, right? That is DOW's mission. And when we look at the overlap of the issues, right? So I don't know the exact stat in child protection, but I know there's an extreme overlap, right, between child abuse and domestic violence. And many of the cases that are seen within DCP&P involve domestic violence, right?
Yeah.
So it's very helpful, right, to have domestic violence expertise sitting within DCF, and DCF is a natural partner for the DV advocates as well.
Yeah.
So I think in that sense, it's a real fit, and also just focus on family and community, right? I think is a natural fit, in the sense that the mission of the Division on Women is really about cultivating opportunities within community and within families and bolstering families, right?
Yeah.
So that everyone can be successful or reach their highest potential, right? And I think that just works so well with the DCF mission. Like DCF and DOW share that mission. And DCF being a very large department also allows us to leverage a lot of its partnerships, its convening power, all of that is very helpful for the work of the Division on Women as well.
Yeah. I think to paraphrase not Governor Brendan Byrne, but another former governor, DCF and DOW, perfect together.
Exactly.
So we talked a lot about a lot of sort of heavy subjects and some of the work that DOW is doing. And there's so many areas that DOW is working right now to elevate women's issues and to support survivors. Let's talk about parties. So we are celebrating 50 years of existence of DOW and all of the advocacy and all of the amazing work that's happened throughout DOW. What is New Jersey doing to commemorate this special occasion?
What are we not? No, definitely. Hopefully, you'll be able to have joined us in our weekly, podcast and Facebook. Really where we've tried to take the past 50 years and highlight what were the issues during that by decade. What were the issues, then, and how do they relate to today? So hopefully, you'll see some of that. If not, maybe tomorrow. Definitely. Hopefully, you'll be able to have joined us in our weekly, podcast and Facebook. Really where we've tried to take the past 50 years and highlight what were the issues during that by decade. What were the issues, then, and how do they relate to today? So hopefully you'll see some of that. If not, maybe tomorrow. Definitely. Hopefully you'll be able to have joined us in our weekly, podcast and Facebook. Really where we've tried to take the past 50 years and highlight what were the issues during that by decade. What were the issues, then, and how do they relate to today? So hopefully you'll see some of that. If not, maybe tomorrow. Definitely. Hopefully you'll be able to have joined us in our weekly, podcast and Facebook. Really where we've tried to take the past 50 years and highlight what were the issues during that by decade. What were the issues, then, and how do they relate to today? So hopefully you'll see some of that. If not, maybe tomorrow. Definitely. Hopefully you'll be able to have joined us in our weekly, podcast and Facebook. Really where we've tried to take the past 50 years and highlight what were the issues during that by decade. What were the issues, then, and how do they relate to today? So hopefully you'll see some of that. If not, maybe tomorrow. Definitely. Have joined us in our weekly, podcast and Facebook. Really where we've tried to take the past 50 years and highlight what were the issues during that by decade. What were the issues, then, and how do they relate to today? So hopefully you'll see some of that. If not, maybe tomorrow. Definitely. have joined us on our weekly, podcast and Facebook, really where we've tried to take the past 50 years and highlight what were the issues during that by decade, what were the issues, then, and how do they relate to today? So hopefully you'll see some of that. If not, maybe tomorrow, definitely hope have joined us on our weekly, podcast and Facebook, really where we've tried to take the past 50 years and highlight what were the issues during that by decade, what were the issues, then, and how do they relate to today? So hopefully you'll see some of that. If not, maybe tomorrow, definitely hope have joined us on our weekly, podcast and Facebook, really where we've tried to take the past 50 years and highlight what were the issues during that by decade, what were the issues, then, and how do they relate to today? So hopefully you'll see some of that. Definitely hope have joined us on our weekly, podcast and Facebook, really where we've tried to take the past 50 years and highlight what were the issues during that by decade, what were the issues, then, and how do they relate to today? So hopefully you'll see some of that. Definitely hope have joined us on our weekly, podcast and Facebook, really where we've tried to take the past 50 years and highlight what were the issues during that by decade, what were the issues, then, and how do they relate to today? So hopefully you'll see some of that. Definitely hope have joined us on our weekly, podcast and Facebook, really where we've tried to take the past 50 years and highlight what were the issues during that by decade, what were the issues, then, and how do they relate to today? So hopefully you'll see some of that. Definitely hope have joined us on our weekly, podcast and Facebook, really where years and highlight what were the issues during that by decade, what were the issues, then, and how do they relate to today? So hopefully you'll see some of that. Definitely hope have joined us on our weekly, podcast and Facebook, really where years and highlight what were the issues during that by decade, what were the issues, then, and how do they relate to today? So hopefully you'll see some of that. Definitely hope have joined us on our weekly, podcast and Facebook, really where years and highlight what were the issues during that by decade, what were the issues, then, and how do they relate to today? So hopefully you'll see some of that. Definitely hope have joined us on our weekly, podcast and Facebook, really where years and highlight what were the issues during that by decade, what were the issues, then, and how do they relate to today? So hopefully you'll see some of that. Definitely hope have joined us on our weekly, podcast and Facebook, really where years and highlight what were the issues during that by decade, what were the issues, then, and how do they relate to today? So hopefully you'll see some of that. Definitely hope have joined us on our weekly, podcast and Facebook, really where years and highlight what were the issues during that by decade, what were the issues, then, and how do they relate to today? So hopefully you'll
Yeah.
see some of that. Definitely hope join us in our weekly, podcast and Facebook, really we're years and highlight what were the issues during that by decade, what were the issues, then, and how do they relate to today? So hopefully you'll
Yeah.
see some of that. Definitely hope join us in our weekly, podcast and Facebook, really we're years and highlight what were the issues during that by decade, what were the issues, then, and how do they relate to today? So hopefully you'll
Yeah.
see some of that. Definitely hope join us in our weekly, podcast and Facebook, really we're years and highlight what were the issues during that by decade, what were the issues, how do they
then,
relate to
and
today? So hopefully you'll see some of that. Definitely hope join us in our weekly, podcast and Facebook, really we're years and highlight what were the issues